Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Tonight I'm talking with Jeffrey Jackson about his new book, Paper Bullets: Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books at the link in the chat that's at the right of your screen. And there's also a link provided at the Atlanta History Center's website. As Jeffrey and I are talking, please do submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to integrate as many of them into the conversation as time allows. Jeffrey H. Jackson is professor of history at Rhodes College. His other books include Paris Underwater and Making Jazz French. He's also co-editor of The Thinking Space and Music and History and The Underground Reader. Paper Bullets tells an extraordinary story, largely unknown really, about two women best known by their pseudonyms, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who used art to undermine the Nazis. It came out just last week and has been longlisted for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. So first, congratulations, Jeffrey, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for hosting the event tonight. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about this book. This is a story that, a lot of people have heard of these two remarkable women, and I'm going to use their given names for the most part, Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe. So can you give us a sense of who they were and who they were to each other?
Yeah, they were two women who were from a background of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper editor and owner, and Suzanne's father was a well-known physician. They grew up in the city of Nantes in southern France, and they were creative from a young age. Lucy was a writer, Suzanne was an artist and illustrator. And they'd known each other from childhood, but once they became teenagers, they fell in love. And so there's really a love story that's at the heart of this. I think it's their love story that helps them do the things that they do and to get through all of the trials and tribulations of the occupation together. But they moved to Paris right after World War I to pursue their artistic career. They become part of the avant-garde art scene. And eventually they leave Paris and move to the island of Jersey. But during that period in Paris, they make some amazing work, some amazing photography. That's perhaps what, if folks have heard of them as Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know their photography, it's in many ways shocking, it's surprising, it's certainly very gender bending. They were playing with ideas about gender and sexuality and representation and what does it mean to look like or to be a man or a woman. So they were very creative, and they were very much resistors their whole lives. And I talk about them in that way throughout the book, that from an early age, they were really pushing boundaries. And so in some ways, those were the kinds of things that carried over into the work that they would do later on in life.
So Paris was much too much for Lucy's health. She was always sort of frail. And in fact, Suzanne was her caretaker at one point in her life. When they moved to Jersey in 1937, this is the British Channel Islands.
That's right.
Just a few nautical miles off of the coast of France, renovated a big house by the sea. But then just 3 years later, Hitler declared war on France and Britain. And within weeks, there are columns of Nazis goose-stepping in the town square. Why was the island undefended by Britain?
So the British decided to essentially abandon the Channel Islands, and part of the reason that they did that was because they just didn't have the resources. They were involved in other efforts. They were evacuating men in Dunkirk. They were trying to defend other aspects of the British Empire and to prepare for this war. And so they just didn't have the resources, and they really didn't think that the Channel Islands would be a theater of battle. So they essentially retreat from the islands. They cut off the telephone line so that if the Germans were to come, that they couldn't use the telephone cable. And sort of the hope is that because this is an undefended territory, that the Germans won't attack. Unfortunately, they forgot to tell the Germans that it was undefended. And so the Germans did attack. They bombed the islands, they strafed them with bullets, and then they land and take over. And it's really not much of a conquest because there's no one on Jersey who can really resist, or any of the Channel Islands that can really fight back. And so when they land at the airport, the bailiff of Jersey, who's the leader of the island, the elected official, he comes and shakes hands and basically surrenders the island without a fight because he really has no other option.
Mm-hmm. So many details in this book. One being that there wasn't even somebody there to signal the air raid drill. So people didn't even know, because that's how small and undefended this island was. But
Right.
they come in and they set up their bureaucracy and their sort of civil government with a long list of rules for locals. So what was life like under occupation on Jersey? And what were some of the rules that they were defying, Lucy and Suzanne?
Well, there were certainly curfews, the rationing of food, and as the war goes on, the rations get more and more extreme. It becomes harder and harder for the Germans to supply the Channel Islands, and so people have to make do with less and less. Little things like they have to move their clocks an hour ahead so that they're on the same time as Berlin rather than on London time. Um, rather than driving on the left-hand side of the road, they have to start driving on the right-hand side of the road. So it works its way down into very much everyday details. There really is a sense that life is different. So they're using occupation money instead of the British pound. But also the presence of these soldiers, there are thousands of German soldiers that end up being on Jersey, in part because Jersey is such a strategically important place. The big change that the islands undergo is that they become part of what comes to be called the Atlantic Wall. And the Atlantic Wall refers to this series of fortifications that the Nazis build that stretch from Scandinavia through the Channel Islands down the French coast. And the idea here is that it's a forward line of defense to prevent Allied invasion. So it turns out that the Channel Islands are very strategic for the German army. And so they start building these gun turrets, these fortifications on the island, and they bring slave labor from the east to build these. And so there's slave labor camps. In fact, there's one just down the road from Lucy and Suzanne's house. So there's a kind of intimacy of living with the enemy that's there. They see these soldiers everywhere. They see the slave laborers out on the beach in front of their house doing construction projects. So it's something that they really can't escape. And so when they decide to resist, there's really nowhere that they can hide because the soldiers literally are everywhere, including right very close to their own house.
Yeah. So they're living at their home. They named it Le Roquez, with their Irish housekeeper, Edna, eventually her husband, George.
Mm-hmm.
And like many islanders, swapping forbidden goods and alcohol, listening in secret to the BBC broadcasts. Some islanders are employed by Germans or otherwise making money from the occupation. Was there any real resistance, organized resistance among the locals?
There was organized resistance. There were several kinds of resistance. There were sort of spontaneous acts that individuals might undertake, but there was also sort of a small scale organized resistance. One of the things that doesn't happen on Jersey or any of the Channel Islands compared to France, for example, is that there's not a sort of large scale organized resistance. And the main reason for that is that people on the islands realize that there's no way they can coordinate any kind of effort, right? They're there alone. And there's a lot of talk about that the island feels like a prison. And so there's never any opportunity, especially given the large number of soldiers, for large groups of people on Jersey to really organize any resistance. But small groups do form. And part of what's interesting is that Lucy and Suzanne originally, when the war begins and they begin to plan their own activities, they really at first, especially Lucy, who's sort of the more pessimistic of the two, kind of has a darker view of human nature. She really feels like no one else is resisting but us, right? All the people on Jersey seem to have just rolled over. That's her impression of things. Eventually, when they're put in prison, they start to meet other people who had been involved in some kind of resistance work. So it's really not until later in the war that they start to really acknowledge and to realize that, in fact, there was this kind of ground level resistance, even if it wasn't, a large scale organized group.
One of our astute panelists pointed out that I was wrong saying that Hitler declared war in 1940. Actually, Britain declared war in Germany in 1939 after Germany invaded Poland. So thank you for that. I was thinking of Eric Larson's book, When All the Fear in 1940 of an Imminent Land Invasion. So I got that wrong. But so anyway, so the newspapers, local newspapers, they're towing the German line. They're listening to the BBC still, and BBC is pretty much going out of its way not to report on the actions against Jews, the anti-Semitic aspects of what is going on in Hitler's fury for the Third Reich. So the goal not to save Jews, how does that fit in for this couple particularly?
Well, I think in a couple of ways. First of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. And even though Lucy herself was not practicing, she had learned about her Jewish heritage from her grandmother. She had sort of adopted elements of a Jewish identity. And so that was certainly part of her animosity against fascism, against Hitler. They had been fighting and sort of writing things and working against and signing petitions against the Nazis for many years, even back in the Paris days. Lucy had grown up when she was a young child, during the heat of the Dreyfus affair. And some folks may be familiar with that who are listening tonight. We can't go into the details of it because it's a very long and complicated story, but it's this very powerful episode of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century in France. And in the city of Nantes, where Lucy and Suzanne both grew up, it led at one point to crowds of people outside of the family apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews," right? So this was very much a formative experience for her. It was very much part of how she understood sort of the politics and how politics could be very personal. Later on, I think one of the things that's interesting is that when they end up engaging in their resistance work, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more here in just a second, but they end up writing notes to the Nazis. And one of the things that they don't do is they don't sort of engage the question of anti-Semitism in their note writing and their resistance work. Instead, they talk to the soldiers about other kinds of things. And I don't think it's because they're ignoring it. I think it's because they're trying to find a way to connect with soldiers, not in an ideological way, but in a very human and sort of personal way. Mm-hmm. So it's not that that's unimportant for them. It's just that I think they make a sort of practical choice about how to frame their resistance, not about, let's not engage the sort of ideological issues about race, but instead, let's talk to these men in a language that they can understand about the issues that, that matter to them in the moment.
That's one of the things that's so extraordinary about the work that they did. And this is something that a form of resistance that Lucy refers to as indirect action. First she thinks she's going to go off to France and fight in the resistance or somehow help. Suzanne pretty much tells her, not in your frail state. That's not something you can do. Mm-hmm. So they start playing with this idea of indirect action. Help us understand that strategy and how it was used. How did it practically play out?
So the idea of indirect action, or Lucy sometimes calls it the indirect effect, is something that she articulates when they're in Paris and they're in this art scene and they're talking with other artists about how should the artist be engaged in politics? What should artists do in order to be politically effective? And the position that she takes among these debates is to say, well, propaganda doesn't work because it's too in your face. It's too emotional. It's too much of a gut reaction that it produces. Instead, she says, what art should do and what the artist should do is try to plant seeds in the minds of other people to get them to change their mind, to think, to be critical thinkers, not to sort of react in a gut way. So she's formulated this back in the mid 30s and the late 30s before they even moved to Jersey. And of course, not knowing that she would have the opportunity to put this into practice. But when they do decide to start their resistance work, and at first Suzanne is reluctant and Lucy sort of has to talk her into it. But when they do decide to do this work, it takes the form essentially of these notes to the Nazis. Suzanne at one point after the war will refer to it as their news service for the Nazis. And basically what they do is they write a series of notes on little slips of paper. Sometimes it's paper that they found. Sometimes it's paper that they've sort of torn out of an old ledger that they had. Sometimes it's cigarette papers that they would buy at the news agent's stand. And they would type these notes or write them, but most often they would type them on their Underwood typewriter. And the notes took various forms. Sometimes they would be little sort of fictional dialogues. Sometimes they would be poems. Sometimes they would be songs. Sometimes they would be these sort of bawdy jokes. Anything that they could figure out to try to plant that seed, again, to use that indirect effect, right? Not a sort of in your face, Hitler is horrible, kind of, trying to evoke a gut reaction, but really sort of trying to get the soldiers who would find these notes to get them to consider, why are we on Jersey? What are we really doing here? Shouldn't I be home with my family, right? They used a lot of language about family and trying to appeal to that side of things. And then they would place these notes all around the island. They would put them on a cafe table, or they would put them into a magazine on the newsstand, or they would pin them up on a fence post. They would slip them into the German staff cars, and even sometimes put them into the pockets of German soldiers walking down the street, and slip it into the pocket of somebody that they were walking near or next to on the street. So it was really a very subtle way, in some ways, of resistance. And yet, you can sort of imagine when the soldier would find this, right? If he would reach in his pocket and find this note or see a note somewhere around the island and read it, and it sounds like the voice of another German soldier, because all these notes were written in German. So they were intended to be, it was intended to sound like a fellow soldier was writing these notes. That would be, I think, from a soldier's point of view, that would be a really shocking sort of thing. And that would be the sort of the indirect effect that would get someone to think about, what is it that I'm doing here on Jersey?
If you've got a question for Jeffrey, please do type it into the Q&A. I will get to as many of them as I can. Carol made a great observation, something that I thought, I smell movie. She says, their story would make a wonderful art house film. Hello, may I speak to Mr. Spielberg or Mr. Clooney? Are you going to fill us in on that, Jeffrey?
It's funny, every time I've told this story, and I've talked to many people about this over the years in talks and audiences and things, and people frequently say that to me. When's the movie coming out? When is the next Netflix series coming out? I'll let other folks kind of behind the scenes work on that. I think, there may be some conversations that folks are having perhaps, but I'm not in the middle of those conversations. So we'll just sort of let that play out and see. But I think part of why people have that response is that not only is it a dramatic story that's not something very familiar, but I think it also kind of puts a different spin on the way we think about the war experience and the way we think about the occupation experience. I think it doesn't feel like the same kind of war story that we've heard or seen depicted in films before. It comes at it from a different angle. Of course, a true story. I mean, it's completely out of the archives, completely grounded in the evidence. But in some ways, that makes it even more compelling, because it is a true story that does somehow seem movie ready made, but yet tells us something different about the war.
Ellen asked, did any residents of Jersey flee before the German occupation?
There was an evacuation that happened as it looked like that the Germans were coming, and so there was a series of evacuation. And Lucy and Suzanne think about leaving; they consider it, and one of their friends leaves, and then actually ends up coming back to the island because she realizes she doesn't really have anywhere to go, and she doesn't have anything to do, so she just ends up coming home. Lucy and Suzanne don't leave, though. Sort of for the same reasons. They're not sure where they would go, what they would do. Again, Lucy's health is a factor in that as well. But I think there's also kind of a sense that, and it at some point it forms in their minds this idea, especially for Lucy, that here on Jersey, maybe we can do something, right? If we went somewhere else, we might not be able to push back. But somehow on Jersey, she even talks about it as having the luxury of resistance, that we are able to unfold this project and engage in this kind of resistance, that we might not be able to do that anywhere else. So it ends up being a decision that has several different factors. And when they do see other people leaving, they see the human drama there. They see families, at the dock trying to decide, what will become of us, what will become of our family, what should we take with us, and they talk about it in their writing, that it's a very poignant sort of moment as they're witnessing other people go through that very difficult decision about whether to leave or whether to stay.
Linda, I'm going to get to your question in a minute, because I think it will come up, the relationship with Germans. But first, just to talk a little bit about this persona that they take on, the soldier with no name.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier how things would burrow into someone's head in a much different way than an on-the-nose kind of criticism of Hitler or the Nazi regime. They're working on a psychological level, and this soldier with no name is an identity that they pick up. What does that mean? What does that persona signify?
So I think the soldier with no name persona is in some ways one of their innovations. It's one of the things that really makes this interesting and special. they decide that one of the best ways for them to do this indirect effect, to get inside the minds of the soldiers, and I talk about it really as a kind of psyops, psychological operation campaign that they invent. They decide that if they take on this persona, that their notes will seem more authentic, will seem more real, because it will be the voice of a fellow German. So in other words, they're sort of invading the inner monologue, right, inside the German military mindset. And planting a seed, or nowadays we might talk about it almost as sort of planting a virus, right? Planting some kind of a foreign idea, right? That will make people think about, what is it that we're doing. And so the other thing, though, that's important to me about that is that this stems, I think, from their earlier work. So a lot of the work they had done in Paris was very much about pushing gender boundaries, crossing gender boundaries. Again, if folks have seen any of their photography from the 1920s, 1930s, and you can certainly search for that on the internet. You can find some on my website as well. A lot of that photography was very much intended to sort of cross gender lines. And so by taking on a male persona, they're doing that again. This is part of, I think, a longer term trend for them. There really is a sort of through line of resistance throughout their lives in many different ways. And a lot of it does sort of turn around questions of gender identity. And so to become, so to speak, a male soldier, writing from his voice, it's something that really kind of comes from who they are, but it really allows them to implement this indirect effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they get bolder and bolder as the war wears on, and the deprivations of the German, their rations get slimmer. The German soldiers begin to question perhaps why they are doing this. And they mount this banner in a church where many soldiers go to worship on Sunday, proclaiming Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler. Mm-hmm. So really wearing at the why are you in this war? And the occupiers' paranoia is also getting cranked up as especially as we get closer to the reversals in Africa, the Stalingrad. The Allies drop leaflets of what's coming as D-Day approaches. How does this affect the occupiers?
Well, there was already a great deal of paranoia among the Germans. Some of the sources that I used for this book are actually declassified British military intelligence files. And one of those, it was MI19, and one of those MI19 files had a report of somebody who had escaped from Jersey and was being debriefed by military intelligence. And he reported that the level of paranoia was just growing by the day on the islands, especially after D-Day, because they're really cut off at that point. They can't really resupply. There is this real sense that that we don't know what's going to happen to these islands. And here we are sort of stuck far away from Berlin, far away from other soldiers. And there was really a sort of a growing sense that maybe the population was beginning to turn. The soldiers really didn't know how this was going to work. And so, but that was true for much of the war. And given the fact that this was such a strategically important area, this Atlantic Wall, they really needed to protect this. I mean, Hitler was receiving regular updates from the Channel Islands about the status of the construction of these fortifications. So it was very important strategically. And in that environment, there really could be no dissent. And so to find these notes, right, again, this sort of drip of finding these notes every day, and I talk about them sort of putting them in a file and watching this file grow over the years. The Secret Field Police, which is the organization that's tasked with keeping order in occupied territories, they hunt for this author, and they think it's one of their own because they think it's this soldier with no name. So they think that the threat is coming from within. Or they don't really know. They suspect that it might be, but it could be a local. They're trying to figure it out too. And then seeing the banner that you described in the church, seeing other kinds of things, it just really drives them. It essentially sort of drives them crazy, right? And they eventually they do end up finding Lucy and Suzanne. They do end up tracking them down, but it takes them 4 years to do it.
Yeah, and there are 3 interrogations and then a trial. There's this mound of collected evidence that they found. As you said, they've been gathering it. and there, I must admit, some surprisingly comic moments as Lucy and Suzanne, especially Suzanne because she speaks German, um, seem to delight in confounding and enraging the Germans, who come off a little Hogan's hero-y in this context. They make no defense for their actions. There's no denial except when things are incorrect. Any particular scenes come to mind for you?
Well, I think it's funny. You're not the first person to make the Hogan's Heroes comparison, and there is a lot of. I mean, it's strange to say, but there is a lot of comedy in the book. I mean, it's not a comedic situation, and yet um, they certainly, I think, Lucy and Suzanne recognize the kind of ridiculousness. Maybe that's a way of putting it. You know, that the the strangeness of the whole scenario, and so. You know, when they're being sentenced, for example, the judge has just said to them, you know, in this very serious way, you are dangerous political criminals, and what you've done is even worse than if you had used weapons, right? That he refers to them as spiritual weapons. These notes are a kind of spiritual weapon. Because with spiritual weapons, we don't know what the damage is, but with regular weapons, we can see the damage. So he's gone through this sort of very serious denunciation of their work, and sentence them to prison and labor and death. There's sort of three sentences. And so Lucy kind of says, well, wait a minute, which are we supposed to serve our prison sentence and then the hard labor and then be executed? You know, how is this supposed to work? And it's almost like she's sort of goading them. It's like, you know, what are you really doing to us here? And then the interpreter breaks in and says, no, the death sentence overrides everything else. And so you can see them even in that moment of being sentenced, that they are kind of playing still, playing with the Germans, playing with the sort of mockery. And in fact, a lot of their notes are very funny. One of the ones that I put in the book is they take this very famous German poem, the Lorelei poem. It's a siren song. It's sort of it's a retelling of the tale of the sirens. And it's a very famous poem in German that gets translated, or gets turned into a song. It's something every soldier would have known. They rewrite the poem as a joke, as a spoof, and they make Hitler the siren goddess who's singing this song to lure sailors to their death. And there's a little drawing that accompanies it of Hitler sort of screaming in this song. And it's just one of the many kind of ways in which they definitely use humor, both in their notes, but then later on, even as they're interacting with the Germans. So I think that's partly maybe just to keep their own sanity, but also I think it's effective. It's part of that idea of the indirect effect, that humor can work even in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, it seems very surrealist to me in origin.
Definitely.
Georgia wants to know, what were they actually charged with and how were they identified?
How were they? What was the last part you said?
How were they identified?
You mean how were they
found? And I know the answer, but you can.
So it's a little bit unclear. I mean, it seems like that most likely what happens is that one of the informers, there are a number of informers on the island, people, the Germans had incentivized this. So, if you would get a reward if you found someone who was listening to an illegal radio or engaging in some other kind of illegal act. And there were certain informers who came to be very well known on the island, including some who informed on people so repeatedly that they were beaten by the locals. It was like, stop informing. You're working against us. We don't know exactly who informed on Lucy and Suzanne. And I can't say with 100% certainty that that's what happened, but that seems to be, in the course of the conversations that they have with the Germans, that seems to be the most likely answer. That seems to be what the Germans essentially say to them, although they never say who it is that informs on them. In terms of the sentence, so they're sentenced for possessing an illegal radio and camera, both of which were supposed to have been turned in. The radio, because they were, you could listen to BBC, and that was part of what they were doing, actually. They were listening to BBC News reports and then summarizing them and translating them into German and circulating those to the German troops. So having illegal radio and an illegal camera, they were, but then ultimately they were sentenced for undermining morale. I mean, that was the big charge against them, was undermining German morale. And I think it's interesting, again, you sort of think, well, leaving notes, how is that really, that doesn't seem like much of a crime, or that doesn't seem like it would really have an impact. But to me, the biggest evidence of the impact that it has is that they are hunted for 4 years and sentenced to death. I mean, that shows, to me, it shows right there that that the Germans took this very seriously, especially in a strategically important area, that there could be no dissent. And so, so clearly these notes were getting under the skin of the German authorities.
The narratives of the interrogations and the trial, they do come from them, which you had to cobble together from notes and scraps of paper. So how do you, as an historian, regard the accuracy of their recollections of these events?
Well, it's a great question, and it's something that I had to sort of wrestle with as I was doing this. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why no one's really written this story before, I think, is that when I went into the archives and I started looking at the material, first of all, it's in a state the likes of which I had not seen before. A lot of it, especially the stuff about the trial and the prison experience, a lot of it is Suzanne's writing. And what she would do is on a piece of paper, sometimes it was a back of an envelope, sometimes it was the back of a calendar, sometimes it was just a blank piece of paper. She would write a few sentences, and then she would draw a line, and then she would write a few more sentences and then draw another line, write a few more sentences, draw another line, and so forth down the page. But none of those sentences had anything to do with each other. They were all sort of separate thoughts. And why she did it this way, I have no idea. But I had to essentially sort of cut and paste, not literally. I took pictures of everything and then moved it around electronically. But I had to piece all of those things together to figure out what was the story that she herself was trying to tell, but doing it in this very fragmented way in the archive, in the documents that remain in the archive. The other thing I had to think about was the fact that these were all post-war reminiscences. These were things that were written later on. And so I had to try to think about, how to situate those memories and to think about the fact that these were filtered through some years that had gone by since then. And to try to, and then also what survives of Lucy's writings, to try to figure out how those two work together, because they tell the story differently in certain cases. Mm-hmm. And then there's the other problem that people who have written something about this part of their lives, very little, but the few pieces that are out there that exist, some articles, book chapter here and there, sometimes attribute Suzanne's words to Lucy, in some cases vice versa. So I had to also really figure out who was saying what. Whose voice was I really hearing here? Was this Lucy's voice? Was this Suzanne's voice? If they both told the same story but told it in different ways, how could I untangle those stories? It was challenging for a lot of reasons. Some of them sort of conceptual, some of them technical. But I hope that the final product is that people will find it interesting. I hope it's worth worth all the effort.
Well, it is a fascinating story. And actually, a couple of people want to know how you first became interested in these two women.
So I first came to know about them through their photography, through the work that they did in Paris in the 20s and 30s. And here I have to give full credit to my wife. My wife is an art historian, and she, for many years, had taught a course on the history of photography, and had taught about the work of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. That's their artistic names that they're most well known for today. And she knew a little bit about the war stuff. She had read it, but very little. And so one night we were talking, and she said, you should look at these photographers. It's really interesting stuff, and there's a connection to fighting the Nazis. So I started looking at the images, and that's really what drew me in. And I began to read some of the sort of art historical work that had been written, stuff from history of photography, and wanted to know more about the war experience. But I wasn't finding that in the material that had been written so far. So as I say, I have to give my wife credit. I always listen to her, and she always has the best ideas. And so I'm thankful to her that she turned me on to this story. And to the amazing art that they produced as well. And as I say, if folks are familiar with it, or if you go find some on the internet, you'll see that it is very much this kind of, it's surrealist, like you said. It's very sort of boundary pushing, It's part of this lifelong story of resistance for these two women, that they, in other words, people don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to resist today. It's really part of a lifelong pattern that they had developed over the years. So in some sense, by the time they got to Jersey, they were already well established in resisting in one way or another.
Yeah, it's definitely worth looking up their photographs. And Claude Cahun is Cahun if you're looking for that. But she is the one who's often, or Claude Cahun, the identity is often credited as an early photographer, art photographer, surrealist, and forerunner of Cindy Sherman. That's something I've seen in a couple of different places.
Mm-hmm.
And for her playing with gender roles, why do you think Suzanne is not given that kind of ownership as a collaborator or a partner?
It's something I've thought a lot about over the years working on this, because it's true that whenever you find their work, if if you see it in a museum or you see it in a gallery or in a book, it's almost always credited to Claude Cahun alone. And I think more and more it's starting to be credited with the two of them. But it was very clear to me in the work that I was doing in the archival material that I was finding, that really we should be thinking of this as a completely collaborative relationship. I think that part of why it's not credited to both of them is that when they were sort of rediscovered, especially in the 1980s, early 90s, there's a sort of big biography that's published of Claude Cahun by a French philosopher who kind of really is responsible for bringing them back to consciousness, because they've been lost for a long time. They just weren't known about, or known in very, very niche circles within the art world. And this biography is a biography of Claude Cahun. And so he really sort of puts the emphasis on her. Cahun, Lucy, had come from an artistic family. As I said, her father was a writer, a newspaper editor. She had a very famous uncle as well, who was a literary light in Paris. His wife was a famous actress. So I think sort of she came from a family which had a lot of documentation, for one thing, had this artistic connection. And the other thing, of course, is that she's the one in most of the photographs. She's the one posing. And so what they've become famous for in particular are the photographs where she's doing these poses and dressed in certain ways that are challenging gender stereotypes or gender roles. So I think a lot of people see her doing that, performing these challenges to gender identity in these photographs, and then assume she's the one who's coming up with the idea here. And I'm not saying that she's not coming up with it, but I really do think it is a collaborative effort. I think one other element to this is that when you look at, as I said, looked at so many of their writings, and really felt like I got to know them through the work that they had written. It's very clear that Lucy is the one, as Claude Cahun, who sort of fits our stereotype of the bohemian artist. She's the more sort of, she's quiet, she's sullen, she's quirky. Whereas Suzanne seems to be more sort of well-adjusted and more more down to earth. So I think Lucy kind of fits almost the stereotype of the sort of kooky creative type. And Suzanne is much more sort of practical and sensible and down to earth, and doesn't quite fit the sort of stereotype of the bohemian artist, even though they were both very much living a kind of bohemian artist life in Paris together in the 1920s.
And of course, those photographs were something that, once discovered, the Nazis circulated around the island as, pornographic, or something that the Nazis would have called degenerate art. But I want to try and get to some of the other questions here. Linda asked about whether they were able to establish relationships with some of the soldiers. And this is one of the things that you spend a good deal of time talking about their experience in prison, because they're there for months,
Mm-hmm.
awaiting trial. And it's cold, it's overcrowded, because they're no longer deporting prisoners to the camps in Germany. The supply lines have been cut off, rations are dwindling. But there are some really surprising interactions with Germans, and camaraderie with others who are in the prison, even German prisoners who were soldiers, deserters, resistance fighters. So these relationships, what does this reveal about who Lucy and Suzanne are?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it in some ways is one of the most surprising parts of the book. And I think it's one of the things that really kind of cuts against our expectations. You know, when you read something about a German prison during World War II, you expect it to be a story where there's violence, torture, brutality. You know, I sometimes talk about it as sort of the History Channel version. But in fact, what we get here is something much more complicated, much more nuanced. There is suffering. Lucy and Suzanne do suffer in prison, but they don't suffer physically. They're not beaten, they're not tortured. They suffer a psychological violence because every day they wake up thinking, today is the last day, we're going to be taken out and executed. And it doesn't work that way, but they live with that anxiety every day. Meanwhile, they also do form these relationships with some of the guards. They I won't say that they become friends with them. I think that would be going too far, but they form a kind of working relationship. Their main jailer, the person who they most frequently interact with, is a man named Otto, and that's all we know about him. We don't know his last name. We don't know anything else about him. He treats them relatively well. When Lucy in particular starts to get ill, he brings her extra food. He helps make sure that she has warm water. They allow other prisoners to interact with them. What they end up talking about when they talk about these soldiers, they basically say, look, these are not, hardcore Nazis. They're regular Germans doing their patriotic duty. They've been drafted. They're from the civilian world. They're not from a military background. They're trying to survive, right? They're trying to live out this war. And it's interesting too that they talk about it in terms of the memories of their own brothers and cousins who had served in World War I. So they say, Lucy and Suzanne say, we had brothers and cousins in the war. We know what soldiers are like. And I think they kind of see their own family in these men who are guarding them. So even though they know that they could be taken out by these very same men and executed, they're able to still somehow see the humanity in these men. They're able to still connect with them on that human level and have conversations with them and joke with them sometimes. And Otto and some of the other guards end up, letting them go and talk to other prisoners, including German soldiers who've been convicted and condemned to death and who will in fact be executed. Lucy and Suzanne are allowed to come out of their cell and to go comfort these men in their final hours before they are taken out by the very same guards and executed. So it's a very strange relationship that they have. It's one where there's still this fear and anxiety and terror of what's going to happen, and yet a kind of strange intimacy. And again, I don't want to call it friendship, but a kind of connection still. The ability to still see the humanity in these guards who are executing, these other soldiers. So to me, that's one of the most surprising aspects of this.
Kimberly says that over the summer she watched, or they happened to watch the Island at War, Masterpiece Theater short series about the Channel Islands and the German occupation. Did not realize that Lucy and Suzanne lived in Jersey. And this alludes to something that you mentioned earlier, that this is not a story that's often told. It doesn't really fit the narrative that, especially in England, that we were not victims, we were victors in this war, which is this why their story has been downplayed, or does it have to do with their gender identity or the fact that their work was not seen for a long time? What's your theory on that?
It's a great question. It's something I've tried to sort of, think through over the years working on this. I think some of it has to do with sort of the role of the Channel Islands, and as you say, the way that it gets sort of folded into this British narrative about victory rather than victimhood. I think also because they're French, living in exile, expatriates essentially living in Jersey. They're not seen as locals. They're still seen as people who are from the outside. Now, I will say more recently, folks in Jersey have embraced much more of the war narrative and the resistance narrative, and they have in fact talked a lot more about Lucy and Suzanne. The Jersey Trust, the Jersey Heritage Trust, which is the local historical society, has done amazing work to really put information on their website, digitize a lot of their documents. They have exhibitions from time to time about Cahoon and Moore, Lucy and Suzanne. And then there have been these productions. I mean, there's Island at War. There was another one a few years earlier, and then of course many folks may have read or seen the movie, the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which is a hard name to remember the whole name, but it's a movie on Netflix. It was also a best-selling novel a number of years ago. So the story has been told more recently, but Lucy and Suzanne are never part of that story. And I think it's for all of these reasons. In addition, the other thing I think is that their documents, a lot of their documents, Suzanne died in the early 1970s. And when she died, the documents were put up for auction and didn't make it back to Jersey until many years later. So I think that the archival record was also just not there. And I think that that kind of prevented people from really digging into the story and finding it. So I'm very lucky that the folks on Jersey have begun to really preserve that and to make it available to folks, because that allowed me to do this work.
Somebody asked actually anonymously, did you go to the Channel Islands to do the research?
I did. I spent some time on Jersey doing this work, and it's a lovely place. It's a beautiful island. I can completely understand why they why they wanted to move there. For them, Paris in the 30s was not a good place. It was becoming more and more politically divided. People were literally fighting in the streets over politics. Fascist groups, communist groups, others, the art world that they were part of was very divided. And so for them, it really was an escape. And, when I went there and experienced it for myself, I could see, what they were searching for was peace and calm and quiet. And that's exactly what Jersey is. It's a lovely place where for them, they were able to buy this big farmhouse made of the local granite, this brown Jersey granite. It had a kind of stability. It almost feels like a fortress in some ways because it's such a heavy stone. And they could sort of shut themselves off from the rest of the world. And that was sort of the choice then, of course, that they had to make, whether to keep the doors closed and just hide out for the war, or whether to engage. And I think part of why they ended up choosing to engage was because, first of all, it had just to do with them and who they were and their personality, but also because it's such a small island too. I mean, you can tour the island in just a few hours, but they were able to use the island to their effect as well. They were able to bring the island into their work. For example, one of their notes says something like, "There's going to be a rendezvous at this one particular location, Plymouth Grotto." Some well-known place on the island, on the north side of the island. So they basically make this note saying, we're going to have a rendezvous there. So the secret field police goes there to find out, to find all of these soldiers who are gathering there. And of course, there's nobody there. They faked it, right? It's not a real rendezvous. But the idea here is that they use the island as part of the deception. And so I highly recommend, if folks have never been to Jersey or never been to the Channel Islands, go. It's a beautiful place, beautiful beaches, the beach right outside their house. They spent hours there sunbathing. It's a lovely place.
I want to get back to something that you started saying before we got to these other questions, but there's another question here about how they survived. And let's just reiterate that they were very wealthy. They came from very, very wealthy families, both of them, and did not work in the conventional sense. But what you were talking about earlier, the way that they were empathizing with somebody with individuals who were the enemy, and looking toward beyond the barriers and towards basic worth and human dignity. There's something you write in the book about an example of Susan Sontag's description of principled resistance. And I thought that might be a nice place to close, because it's something that in an era when our own country is really divided, the idea of how you hold yourself up and have dignity for the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to me, one of the things that's so amazing about their story is their ability to have this kind of radical empathy for the enemy. They're really living out that idea of loving your enemy. Because I think for them, they saw what they did as an act of rescue. I think that what they basically had come to the conclusion was that the soldiers that were there on Jersey, these regular men who've been taken out of their lives, away from their families, and sent off to this island, that these men were being duped by Hitler. That in a sense they were a type of victim, and this is, I think, the way Lucy and Suzanne talk about it. So that their notes, these notes that they're writing, are really a kind of act of rescue to try to help these men to through the indirect effect that we were talking about, to wake up and to realize what's going on, in the hopes that these men would say, I've had enough, and would leave and would go home. And what's interesting, at the very end of the book, I talk about that they receive a letter from one of the former guards. This is after the war is over. He's in a POW camp under British arrest. And he writes them a letter. One of their former guards writes them a letter and basically says, hello, I'm doing well. Hope you're doing well too. My family is safe. And I was really sort of shocked by that, right? You don't expect a former guard to write to one of the people that he had imprisoned. But I think that's that's some evidence of the way in which they were able to sort of bridge that gap and to sort of make the human connection, and to make it real. Again, still living with the fear that these same men might somehow take them out, might one day take them out and shoot them. But to find the humanity in those guards too. And I think that's something that, it's food for thought. Not everybody could do that. Most of us, I think, probably could not do that and would not do that. But they were able to do that.
Well, what a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to lead the conversation tonight. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, and we do hope there's going to be a movie or a series, so we will be looking for that for you. Jeffrey Jackson's new book is called Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis. We do encourage you to buy it from Acapella Books. There are more author talks coming up, virtual author talks. You can go to the Atlanta History Center website to see a full schedule and links to see ones in the future. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thanks for all your great questions, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.